Hello and welcome back to Behind the Folklore. My name is Liz, and today I will be telling you how I believe the harsh climate, court system, and lifestyle of the ancient Scandinavian people developed one of the first zombie stories. Without further ado, let's get started. If you're like me, you probably heard of the Draugr because you spent too many hours playing Skyrim. For those who don't know, which is probably not a lot, it is a game that is riddled with not so subtle nods towards early Scandinavian culture. It wasn't until years later that I had learned that they weren't just made up for the Elder Scrolls series, they were actually a very real fear for ancient Scandinavian people. To understand why the Draugr came into existence, I think we have to first understand what life was like for people living in Scandinavia, specifically Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, and the Faroe Islands, during and after the 8th century. I wasn't able to find a lot of information about Scandinavian history prior to the late 8th century, but I think it's safe to say that they weren't easy times for the early people of Northern Europe, given the climate and the lay of the land is very harsh even today. Given the severe circumstances, the concept of death was not uncommon for them. Information on life in Scandinavia after 793 AD is a lot easier to find since it marks the beginning of the Viking Age, which lasted from that year until 1066. Coincidentally, 3 of the countries where the Draugr lore originates were also the same countries involved in the raids and expeditions that are associated with Vikings today. Focusing on these raids and, other related actions, it's seen that Vikings also had occupations in their homelands, ranging from farming to blacksmithing. There were an array of reasons that historians think people might have taken up raiding foreign lands, but the one that stood out to me for this specific topic was that it was very profitable. It was so profitable that many of the farmers and others turned to raiding full time. Circling back to the possible reasons people of Sweden, Norway, and Denmark might have taken up, Viking lifestyles, a good number of them do have their roots in what I personally consider to be human greed and envy. While there's other reasons like, wanting to get out there and explore, I'll be focusing on those selfish reasons. Many of the towns and monasteries that were attacked had little to no defenses and a lot of tempting treasures, so some historians have theorized that Vikings were tempted by these easily reachable riches. In modern archaeological digs, Viking burial mounds were found with various valuables ranging from weapons to ornate hair combs buried with the dead. So it's safe to say that, as many people did and still do in a lot of cultures, the early Scandinavians treasured their earthly possessions. Another reason that has been put forward is that many of the families in Scandinavia had younger sons who would not be inheriting lands when the male head of the household died. Traditionally, the eldest son in a family would inherit all of the land and any other assets, so for families with multiple sons, this meant there would be nothing left for the younger siblings. So what would these young men do without any land to their name? I think it's perfectly reasonable that they might turn to raiding and exploring as a means to support themselves. Moving back to the home front, it's seen that the early Scandinavian people counted on meats and dairy and homegrown produce to survive. This isn't much different from any other feudal societies of the time or after, but with that being said, it's not unreasonable to think that there could have been foodborne illnesses that could have led to some untimely deaths. As seen in other regions during the later medieval period, disease became much more frequent when people lived in unclean conditions and had close contact with animal waste. Given there weren't any microscopes to check for parasites or other things that can cause such illnesses, and there weren't any preventions to keep livestock from getting infected, it's very possible that many of the early deaths that weren't able to be blamed on violence or accidents or old age were the result of contaminated food and unsanitary conditions. While it was common for early Scandinavians to bathe and keep themselves clean, that doesn't mean their surroundings were always spotless. Now, even if they were able to keep their surroundings spotless, again, they had no ways to tell if an animal was infected with anything. So I believe that they also could have easily come into contact with parasites and, just infected meats very easily just from eating. While it's not common for a parasite to kill its host, it can lead to other fatal diseases. There is one more aspect of early Scandinavian culture that I'd like to cover before going into the lore behind the Draugr, and that's what it was like living under a Viking government. The Vikings only had runic writings, so there's not much in the way of written law that anyone has found. So, from what historians have been able to gather, the free men of the communities would gather to decide on laws and rule on cases. Such gatherings were called it's spelled thing, but I think it's pronounced ting. My pronunciations are only going to get worse through this episode, so you have been warned. But no matter what it was called, these meetings were held to help avoid duels or feuds between individuals or even families. Though these men were in charge of lawmaking and rulings, they were not able to fully carry out sentences. During the trial, if the defendant was found guilty, there was a number of punishments that could be imposed upon them. They could be fined, which is something that we still use today. They could be declared a semi-outlaw, or they could even fully be outlawed. If that person was fully outlawed and banished, their properties and possessions were taken from them, and they were not allowed any aid from the local people. On top of that, the guilty party was able to be killed by anybody, and I believe it was actively encouraged. So obviously for these reasons, many of those who did manage to survive quickly left their countries. So clearly from that quick crash course of Scandinavian history, it's easy to see that people that lived during the Viking Age were very well acquainted with death and other hardships from the beginning. So with that, let's get into the lore surrounding the Draugr. Draugr had many names, obviously, since they had roots in multiple Scandinavian countries. Most of them stem from the root Draug. Other names are Afterganga and Afterganga. Those translate to after walker or again walker. They're also closely related to the Haugbui, which translates to barrow dweller, and this certain undead being cannot leave its tomb, which differs from the Draugr, who can roam around the land. They were corpses possessed by human spirits, and they all were said to have various supernatural powers. For example, they could change their size, as well as they had superhuman strength. They're often compared to vampires, modern-day zombies, which is my personal favorite comparison, and also ghosts. The physical description of these monsters is not consistent, but they are all disgusting as they correspond with the various stages of decomposition. Sometimes they were said to look bloated, others were described as being emaciated. Their skin color ranged from a necrotic black color to a sickly blue or deathly pale shade. While the visual depictions of Draugr changes from story to story, they always carry the smell of decay with them, which makes sense since they are walking corpses. The creation of Draugr could happen in a number of ways. Some people believed that if a person passed away while sitting up or just generally out of a horizontal position, that meant they would rise again as a Draugr. On occasion, a person could be cursed to become one. If a person was mean, greedy, or just a general outcast while they were alive, they could also become a Draugr once they died. The last way a Draugr was created relates heavily to the creation of vampires or zombies. If a person was killed by a Draugr, then they would become one as well. Moving on to what their motivations might have been, let's go over what Draugr were said to do when they were out and about. While a Draugr was not necessarily tied to their burial site and could be seen roaming around the lands, some lore says that they would steal valuables and hoard them in their dwellings. It was also said that they enjoyed the taste of blood, so it was very common to hear stories of Draugr attacking and devouring not only trespassers in their graves, but also wild animals, livestock, and even people who were just away from their homes. Even when there were no vicious attacks to blame on these monsters, many people believed they were the source for diseases that broke out among the population, whether it was the livestock or even the people themselves. Death by Draugr was not always quick, it rarely was. These monsters were driven by hatred and possessed human-level intelligence, and they knew just what to do with that. It was said that they enjoyed seeing their prey suffer, so more often than not, stories spoke of how Draugr would change their size and sit on the chests of their victims, causing a slow death. The power of changing their size was not the only magic that the Draugr was said to possess. It was also believed that they cursed living people, which I had just mentioned while talking about the creation of these monsters, shape-shifted, entered the living's dreams, and even imposed such bad luck on people that it could lead to their deaths. So just from this brief description of Draugr, it's easy to see that if these monsters were real, an encounter with one would almost certainly result in death. But just how could a potential victim enter a confrontation with one and live to tell the tale? There were a few ways to prevent a Draugr from leaving their grave and defeat them if they did rise, and we will be covering those in this section. Those who were believed to become a Draugr once they died were carried out of the home feet first. It was believed that this would prevent the spirit from knowing where to re-enter the home, which seems a little silly because I feel like if that's where they lived, they'd probably know where, other ways to get into the house are. But if it helped them sleep at night, hey, who am I to judge? For good measure, the door that they were carried out of would often be covered up to prevent them from using it again if they figured out where to go back to. As Christianity started to take hold of the Scandinavian countries, holy water being used to purify homes also became a common practice. In a similar fashion, the dead person's coffin would be constantly lifted and lowered in 3 different directions on the way to the burial site to cause confusion. Once in their grave, the dead were often buried with their big toes or the soles of their feet tied together. An open pair of iron scissors would also be placed on the body's chest, and straws and twigs would be placed in the clothing. I understand these scissors, but I still haven't figured out what the reasoning behind these straw and twigs is. It was also imperative that the body was placed in a horizontal position. But, what if these measures failed, or maybe they weren't taken or done, in the right way? Then a person had no choice but to try to kill this thing that was immune to most physical injury and pain. So clearly it wasn't a very easy thing to do. Like many other monsters and creatures from other folklores, a Draugr could be killed by fire, but it had to be completely burnt to ash. Those ashes then had to be thrown to the sea, which, if you managed to burn this thing alive and you lived in a coastal town, you were set. But I don't know how people who lived inland would have managed this. Another way to get rid of a Draugr was to completely decapitate it, but the only weapons that would work against this thing had to be made purely of iron. Iron was a rare commodity in the Viking Age Scandinavia, so really it was only available to the rich few that could afford it. So I guess if you were poor, you were shit out of luck. So, what could have been the inspiration behind these horrifying monsters? Naturally, the fear of death can be blamed for these stories. What happens after death is still very unknown in modern times, so it's only natural that there would have been such a dread and a fear towards it back during the creation of many mythologies and folk stories. Death marks the end to all that a person knows, and even though there is nothing to experience in the living world after death occurs, it marks a great change, and change is also a huge fear for a lot of people. As for the origins and traits of the Draugr, I believe there is a number of reasons that these came to be. It can easily be seen that the Draugr, while representing the horrors of death, also represent the horrors of the life that the people of the time were living. Through the evidence that the monsters would hoard treasures and kill animals and people alike with no discretion, and they would gorge themselves on those victims, they most likely represented the greed and violence that was prevalent in those times. Through the course of history, we can see that many other creatures represent the events and issues of their time. Much of vampire lore, though it came later on, can be compared to the leech-like habits of various ruling classes and those who would gain their wealth and power at the expense of others. The fears surrounding witches during medieval and Renaissance Europe can be attributed to the church and patriarchal societies fearing women, as well as the occasional man who possessed knowledge and free will and power and thought for themselves. Is it really that unreasonable to believe that the Draugr stories could have been influenced by the rise of raids and violence in the exploration of unknown lands? Lastly, I believe the Draugr myth was partially influenced by the fear of being outlawed and outcasted following a trial. Even today, the wilderness of Scandinavia is very dangerous if a person is not prepared for it. So just how dangerous would it have been during the Viking Age, when those around were not only forbidden to help someone stuck in them, but also allowed to harm them? Given that one of the ways a person could turn into a Draugr after death was just being a general outcast before their death, maybe this monster started as a cautionary tale against going, against the social norms of the time. Similarly, people who were actively accepted by that society might have seen the outcasts as something to be feared and hated, much like the Draugr were feared and hated. Thank you all for tuning into this episode of Behind the Folklore. Join me again next time to learn about the spooky origins of the Headless Horseman, more specifically the Irish spirit called the Dullahan and how it relates to a pagan god and one of the first High Kings of Ireland. Until then, have an amazing week.